David Wood is a senior Lebanon analyst with the International Crisis Group. You're joining us from Broummana in Lebanon. I want to pick you up on what Zaina just said at the end of her report there, that observation that many feel this is not just a vote for the president, but it is the opening of a new phase in Lebanon's history. Do you agree with that?
So I think that this is obviously good news for Lebanon, that finally, after more than 2 years, the presidential vacuum has been filled and there is a head of state. But any optimism needs to be cautious, because we saw today that not just was Joseph Aoun elected with 99 out of 128 votes in the parliament, which is a really strong mandate, but also his speech upon accepting the election was very encouraging for reform-minded Lebanese, and it did suggest that a new chapter might be coming in Lebanese history. At the same time, both Lebanese and people outside the country need to be aware that he cannot be a miracle worker. So the presidency in Lebanon is a very important figurehead, and it's important to have a president in place. But the president itself doesn't actually have that much power. Most of the executive governance in Lebanon is actually done by the government. So the next crucial step will be to elect the new government. Joseph Aoun will be involved in these consultations, but the formation of that government and the ministers that form part of it and their attitude towards reforms that have been mentioned before by Zaina will be incredibly important to determine whether they can actually be realised.
So what you say is really interesting. Lebanon is routinely described as being paralyzed, right? Political paralysis, which makes reform impossible, which makes any assistance by the international community impossible. You're saying this is not the end of political paralysis?
Well, not necessarily, because even if Joseph Aoun, now that he's been elected, even if there's a government that largely aligns with his reform goals, even in those circumstances, the president and the government would still need cooperation from Lebanese actors to implement the most ambitious of these proposed reforms. So, for example, as Zaina mentioned before, a really striking part of Joseph Aoun's acceptance speech was when he mentioned that the state would have monopoly over arms in Lebanon. Now, that's obviously a reference to Hezbollah's military program, but the Lebanese state cannot realistically disarm Hezbollah without Hezbollah's cooperation. Another key reform that was mentioned was restructuring Lebanon's broken banking system.
Pause right there, if you don't mind, because that's so important, right?
Sure.
You're saying he was not going to be able to, the army will not be able to disarm Hezbollah without Hezbollah's cooperation. Is there any reason to believe that Hezbollah would lay down their arms, cooperate with the army on something like that?
So up until now, since the ceasefire agreement was reached, Hezbollah has made clear that it will comply with the ceasefire agreement concerning the areas south of the Litani River in Lebanon, which is near the Lebanese-Israeli border. But it has insisted that it will not disarm completely throughout the rest of the country. Now, there are scenarios where, as time goes by, Hezbollah might see an interest in cooperating closely with the army in terms of either dismantling its infrastructure or revisiting proposals from decades ago to actually integrate Hezbollah and its fighters and its weapons into the army. But this is a step that cannot be forced on Hezbollah. It would require its cooperation, firstly, because Hezbollah and its allies have legitimate representation inside the incoming government, they have it inside the parliament and Lebanon state institutions. And secondly, despite the massive blows Hezbollah suffered during its recent war with Israel, it retains residual military strength, which would make, for example, deploying the Lebanese army to disarm Hezbollah an incredibly risky move that the Lebanese state would not seriously entertain.
Lebanon has been caught up for years now in a crippling economic, banking, and financial crisis, right? We are led to believe that the way out of this crisis is reforms, which would then unlock financial assistance by the international community. Where the reforms have not happened, so the assistance by the international community has not happened. Do you think that could change?
Potentially. I mean, even the fact that Joseph Aoun was elected today was something that was probably unthinkable, especially with Hezbollah's direct support, even months ago. But a lot has changed. The region is changing. Hezbollah has been forced into a more defensive posture than before. And Hezbollah is also facing the need, along with the rest of the Lebanese, to attract funding not just to resolve the country's crippling economic crisis, but also to deal with post-war reconstruction. So it's clear that key financial backers, including Saudi Arabia, have made it very clear that there will be no significant financial aid for Lebanon without significant and genuine reforms to the country's economic system. And this is a key point as well. So if Joseph Aoun wants to follow through on his pledge, which is to restructure the banking sector, that will require the cooperation of Lebanon's political elites, both inside the incoming government potentially, but definitely inside the parliament. And we know that many of Lebanon's politicians have very strong and deep links to the banking sector. And that has been a key factor that's frustrated economic reforms thus far. So again, Joseph Aoun is sending the right messages, but it will take more than just one man to resolve Lebanon's multifaceted crises.
Okay, great to talk to you today. David Wood of the International Crisis Group. Thank you for joining us on the Al Jazeera News Hour.
Thanks for having me.
Make sure to subscribe to our channel to get the latest news from Al Jazeera.